In 1948, the State of Israel was proclaimed. Palestine was lost. 16 years later, in 1964, the Palestine Liberation Organization, or the PLO, was founded. Made up of different factions, the PLO has been at the heart of the struggle to regain Palestine ever since. Following expulsion from Jordan, PLO leader Yasser Arafat decided to pursue the path of diplomacy. There were hopeful signs in the early 70s, but the optimism was all to come crashing down.
لقد جئتكم يا سيادة الرئيس بغصن الزيتون في يدي وببندقية الثائر في يدي فلا تسقط الغصن الأخضر من يدي لا تسقط الغصن الأخضر من يدي
لا تسقط الغصن الأخضر من يدي
لا تسقط الغصن الأخضر من يدي.
In November 1974, Yasser Arafat received a standing ovation at the General Assembly of the United Nations. He had spoken of a peaceful solution to Palestinian demands for a homeland. For the guerrilla leader, standing among statesmen, it was a crowning achievement. Arafat's journey to the UN had begun several years earlier. Following their expulsion from Jordan, some Palestinian factions concluded their fiery rhetoric and revolutionary zeal had harmed rather than helped their cause.
Are you saying at the same time that there will be an increase in terrorism outside?
No, I am saying there will be an increase in revolutionary struggle inside Palestine. And I refuse the word terrorism because we are not terrorists. Our people in Palestine, if you are following them, they are doing demonstrations every day in Nablus, in Ramallah. They are refusing the Israeli conquer. Why do you call this terrorism?
But if at the same time you hijack international aircraft and hold as hostages innocent women and children, how do you expect the rest of the world to sympathize and respect the Palestinian cause?
First of all, the PFLP has declared lately that we stop this type of actions. This is number one. And number two, during all these actions which were done previously, we did not do harm to anybody.
However, PFLP operative Wadi Haddad did not agree with Habash. Haddad dissented and was expelled from the group. But this did not prevent him from organizing further operations. In 1975, he sent a group headed by the Venezuelan revolutionary Carlos to Vienna to storm a meeting of OPEC and take several oil ministers hostage. But Haddad was angry that Carlos had not followed the meticulous plans he had drawn up.
الشيء اللي يمكن وديع لم يكتشفه في كارلوس هو هاي الذاتية اللي كان فيها في داخله.
What Wadia may not have realized about Carlos is his narcissism, which manifested itself in the OPEC operation. Carlos acted against Wadia's orders, and when they met afterwards, Wadia slapped him. I think when Carlos negotiated and released the oil ministers, it gave the impression that he could be bribed, which was a main reason for the failure of the operation. From that moment, Wadia broke his connection with Carlos.
A year later, a group of Haddad's followers hijacked an Air France airliner to Entebbe, Uganda. The Israelis mounted a spectacular rescue operation, killing all the hijackers and freeing the hostages. Despite these acts of violence, the political track was moving. Following the 1970 expulsion from Jordan, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the DFLP, believed a more realistic political program was required. In 1972, it had floated the idea of accepting a two-state solution. By the summer of 1974, the PLO had unanimously adopted the DFLP's 10-point plan. For the first time, the Palestinians spoke about establishing an independent national authority. The word Israel was never explicitly mentioned in the plan, but after years of armed struggle, the Palestinians were now implicitly recognizing the State of Israel.
لأنه البرنامج عرضته القيادة العامة وتمت وسمي برنامج المستسلمين.
It was opposed by the pro-Syrian PFLP General Command and called the defeatist agenda. But Arafat and Abu Iyad were smart. They used the DFLP as a bulldozer or minesweeper to clear the way for it.
ونشب النقاش ممتدا ما يقارب العام الكامل.
It took almost a year of discussions, and on the eve of the PNC session in June of 1974, we came to a consensus with Fatah, the PFLP and the pro-Syrian Sa'iqa, and the 10-point program was adopted.
Just weeks prior to his speech at the UN, Arafat received the mandate he'd long been seeking from Arab leaders. The Arab League summit in Rabat stripped Jordan of its traditional role in Palestinian affairs and named the PLO as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. For the Palestinians, it was a dream come true. Their decision-making would no longer be bound by the yoke of Arab diktat, although Arab states would continue to try and exert influence on Palestinian matters. The Jordanians felt the Rabat summit decision pointed the finger of blame at them.
I wonder what would have happened if His Majesty had expressed his displeasure by withdrawing from the Rabat summit while leaving his Prime Minister there. Jordan was being harassed. Jordan was made out to be the root of the problem, not Israel.
Soon after Arafat's triumph at the UN in November 1974, consensus among the different Palestinian factions over the two-state solution proposal began to falter. After its expulsion from Jordan, the PLO had moved its headquarters to the Lebanese capital, Beirut. In April 1975, civil war broke out in Lebanon. Lebanese politics divided into two camps, a Christian-led right and a Muslim-dominated left led by the socialist Druze politician Kamal Jumblat. For years, Lebanon's Muslims had clamored for a fairer distribution of political power. The Palestinians felt a natural affinity for their cause. Desperate not to repeat the mistakes committed in Jordan, the PLO leader sought to keep his forces out of the Lebanese conflict.
I know that Arafat tried to keep the Palestinians out of the war at the beginning, but that was never going to be possible. Impossible. Especially with the common nationalisms, you know, the Kamal Jumblat version of nationalism and the Palestinian version of nationalism.
But by 1976, the Palestinians no longer felt able to stay on the sidelines in Lebanon. Palestinian fighters linked up with the leftist forces and gradually advanced into the Christian heartland. Syria found the idea of a PLO-backed regime in Lebanon a recipe for disaster. It feared such a regime would provoke Israel into military action that would drag Syria into war. For their part, Israel and the United States also took a dim view of the rise of the Lebanese left and its Palestinian allies. In one of the more bizarre alignments of interests in Lebanon, Syria decided to throw its weight behind the Christians. With a green light from Washington and tacit Israeli consent, Syria sent its army into Lebanon in June of 1976 to stem the Palestinian leftist advance.
Syria was asked to intervene to curb the expansion of the Palestinian and Lebanese leftists. The Lebanese left had become troublesome to Arab regimes. The leader of the left, Kamal Jumblat, was viewed as a threat to Lebanese and Arab stability. Another factor was the mutual dislike between Arafat and Syrian President Assad.
Syria's military intervention was stepped up following an assault on a Damascus hotel by the anti-Arafat Abu Nidal Palestinian group. The perpetrators were quickly apprehended and hanged in public. Faced with the Syrian onslaught, Arafat appealed to the Arab world for assistance, accusing Syria of attempting to liquidate the Palestinian resistance. The Syrian assault forced the Palestinians onto the defensive. they were no longer able to mount an effective resupply of their besieged refugee camps in the Christian areas. The camps, principal among which was Tel Zatar, were overrun and their residents expelled or massacred. 2 Arab summits were quickly convened. They established what became known as the Arab Deterrent Forces, made up principally of the same Syrian forces that had entered Lebanon, with only token representation from several other Arab states. Syria had prevailed.
President Assad's view was that Syria, in its bid to achieve strategic parity with Israel, had to be supported by 2 strong wings, a Lebanese wing and a Palestinian wing. That is, if Syria was to have influence on the political scene, it had to become the sole legitimate representative of Syria, Lebanon, and the Palestinians.
While Lebanon was in the throes of conflict, on another front, there were moves towards peace. In 1977, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, a long-standing ally of Arafat, made a groundbreaking visit to Israel to sue for peace in exchange for land. Arafat was stunned. But Arafat had been making his own peace moves. His representative in London, Said Hamami, had been promoting the Palestinian vision of a 2-state solution at Arafat's behest.
Arafat and the Palestinian leadership were convinced that the most important thing was achieving Palestinian aspirations, not the method employed to achieve them. And if the method to achieve them was a civilized and peaceful one, then that would be better than a violent one. Arafat and the PLO leadership firmly believed this.
Chairman Arafat knew very well that the 1973 war demonstrated the limits of collective Arab action and what the international community could accept. Therefore, the leadership of Fatah was convinced that the Palestinians could never achieve anything more than a state based on the lands occupied in 1967.
But some Palestinians took a very different view. Palestinian guerrilla leader Abu Nidal believed the 2-state solution was tantamount to capitulation. He split from the PLO and formed his own group, calling it Fatah, the Revolutionary Council, and based it in Baghdad. The Iraqi regime, once again hostile to Arafat's leadership of the PLO, provided backing to Abu Nidal's splinter group. In January of 1978, gunmen loyal to Abu Nidal assassinated Said Hamami at the PLO office in London. It was to be the first of many killings of fellow Palestinians that Abu Nidal would carry out. Despite its talk of a 2-state solution, the mainstream Fatah under Arafat did not relinquish its armed struggle. In March 1978, a Fatah unit led by a female commando, Dalal al-Mughrabi, commandeered an Israeli bus near the city of Haifa. In the ensuing firefight, 36 Israelis were killed. Israel responded by invading southern Lebanon and setting up what it termed as a security zone to drive PLO forces out of rocket range. Almost a year later, Israel struck a massive blow against the PLO by assassinating Abu Hassan Salameh. Salameh was in charge of Arafat's personal security. Over the years, he had been developing contacts with the CIA and was seen as a point man for interaction with the Americans.
We had, through the CIA, some kind of a liaison relationship with Ali Hassan Salameh, and that had to do ostensibly with security issues. And it worked. The embassy was never attacked in those days. Now, people still argue whether that relationship led to Ali Hassan Salameh becoming an agent of the CIA or not. I personally think that he did, but I can't prove it. I was in government during that period, and we were in fact receiving remarkably sensitive intelligence from inside the PLO at the highest levels. And if it wasn't Ali Hassan Salameh, it was somebody very much like him.
Arafat could do little to parry such blows being delivered by Israel. But it was a different matter when Abu Nidal resumed his assassination of Fatah representatives abroad. In June 1978, from his base in Baghdad, Abu Nidal ordered the killing of Fatah's bureau chief in Kuwait. Fatah explicitly accused Iraqi intelligence of complicity in the assassination. 2 months later, the Abu Nidal group killed Fatah's Paris representative. Fatah retaliated by attacking the Iraqi embassy in Paris and targeting Iraqi diplomats in London, Paris, and Karachi. Abu Nidal struck yet again on June 1st, 1981, killing the PLO Brussels representative. But Abu Nidal's most significant operation was to come a year later. On June 3rd, 1982, an Abu Nidal gunman opened fire on Israel's ambassador to London, critically wounding him. Israel responded by launching a military operation more massive than its 1973 war effort against the combined forces of Egypt and Syria. The 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon had been an open secret for some time. The Lebanon-Israel border had been a constant point of tension as Palestinians and Israelis traded rocket and artillery fire. Arafat had realized that it was only a matter of time before Israel launched an all-out attack.
الوحيد اللي بدأ يعمل حساب لهذا الاحتمال هو ياسر عرفات.
Arafat was the only one who believed an Israeli invasion which would reach Beirut was inevitable. He convened the PLO's military council and formed a committee headed by the PLO's chief of staff Saad Sail to plan the defense of Beirut.
Many Palestinians expected a repeat of the 1978 invasion, an assault with limited objectives.
ساد مناخ يعتقد فعلا بأن العملية الإسرائيلية لن تكون شاملة.
The belief was that the Israeli operation would not extend beyond 40 kilometers from the international border. This affected Palestinian preparations for the invasion, as well as Syrian and Lebanese preparations. Therefore, resistance to the invasion in southern Lebanon was ineffective.
On June 6, 1982, after 2 days of airstrikes, Israel launched its land invasion of Lebanon. With the exception of stiff resistance put up by the defenders of the Palestinian refugee camps in southern Lebanon, Palestinian forces in general quickly collapsed. Commanders abandoned their fighters in the field and fled for safety. Arafat was livid.
Arafat was incredulous. He kept on saying impossible. He couldn't believe the Israelis were advancing so far, so quickly. He ordered stiff resistance. Later on, I learned that he was very angry that there was no real resistance.
The operational headquarters in the south seriously miscalculated. The commanders believed that all was lost and left. I went to Arafat's headquarters in Beirut and told him what happened. He became agitated and started swearing.
Syrian forces in Lebanon were drawn into the fighting. An epic 3-day air battle left the Syrian Air Force virtually decimated. Unable to sustain such losses, Syria agreed a ceasefire with Israel within the first week of the invasion. The Palestinians were now left on their own.
Arafat did not just accept that the Syrians had been defeated. He made it seem like the Syrians didn't fight at all. But the Syrians did fight in the Bekaa Valley and the mountains around Beirut and lost lots of men and equipment, but they fought to defend themselves and not the Palestinians. The Syrian army had no orders to check the Israeli advance if the Israelis had left the Syrians alone.
By now, the Israelis had arrived at the gates of the Lebanese capital. But the closer they drew to Beirut, the tougher the fighting became.
They fought, and they fought very bravely against the Israelis, very bravely.
The siege of Beirut had begun. The PLO was encircled. Some Palestinian leaders advised the PLO should surrender, but Arafat had other ideas.
At one early meeting, the leader of the PFLP General Command, Ahmed Jibril, suggested accepting Israeli terms of withdrawal under the banner of the Red Cross, disarmed and in Red Cross provided overalls. Arafat said he would say a prayer to help him arrive at a decision. So he went away and returned and said, "I sense the winds of heaven blowing. God has ordered me to fight."
The winds of heaven, as Arafat described them, meant holding out for better conditions. In a bid to raise morale, Arafat and his officials toured the streets of the besieged Lebanese capital. Massive Israeli bombardment caused civilian casualties, but also strengthened the Palestinians' resolve. Finally, in August, after 2 months of siege and bombardment, US envoy Philip Habib announced that an agreement had been reached. The agreement gave safe passage for the PLO fighters to leave Lebanon on the understanding that Israeli forces would not enter West Beirut. The evacuation of the PLO marked the end of an era. After more than 10 years in Lebanon, the PLO was finally leaving. It was a dramatic moment for the fighters, for the Lebanese, and for the Palestinian refugees left behind. Most PLO leaders left to Damascus. But Arafat, signaling his displeasure with Syria, chose to go to Greece. Within days of the departure of the last Palestinian fighters, Lebanese President-elect Bashir Gemayel was assassinated. Breaking the American brokered agreement, Israeli forces moved into West Beirut under the pretext of keeping the peace. The Israelis accused the PLO of leaving 2,000 of its fighters in Beirut's refugee camps. The charge was a fabrication. The Israelis quickly encircled the refugee camps and brought in their allies from the Christian Lebanese Forces militia. On September 16, 1982, dozens of Lebanese Forces militiamen entered the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps.
We knew, of course, that the Israeli had surrounded the camp, and we also knew that in the night the flares was there, that the camp was lighted up. We saw it from far distance. And after I remembered, the night was very strange. It was so quiet. It was like a ghost town. And we didn't realize that inside this ghost town was the killing and the shooting.
Under the watchful eyes of their Israeli allies, the Lebanese militiamen embarked on one of the most horrific massacres of modern times. Skies were lit by Israeli flares as the militiamen continued their ugly work.
And then we came in the same way, and we saw the bodies. And I went around with my tape recorder. I had no crew, I had no television crew in the beginning, to count bodies, throwing up, counting bodies.
De har åpenbart blitt mishandlet. Et 20-talls menn fra 14.
And the more bodies we found out was there, in alleys, women killed, children killed, and we also saw they had used bulldozers to take the rubble over the dead bodies. We couldn't believe our eyes.
By the time it was finished, the Sabra and Shatila massacre had claimed the lives of some 800 Palestinian and Lebanese civilians. The Israelis set up a tribunal to investigate the massacre. In its final report, the Kahan Commission found that Israeli Defense Minister Ariel Sharon bore personal responsibility for the massacre. The PLO, in exile and no longer the force it once was, could only watch impotently. Stripped of his base in Lebanon, Arafat was in a political wilderness. Israel and its American benefactors had established a foothold in Lebanon, one that Syria, backed by the Soviet Union, sought to overthrow. In the eyes of Damascus, the much-weakened PLO was ripe for the taking, and the defeated Yasser Arafat was of no political consequence. But for the master of Palestinian politics, who had just emerged from doing battle with the Israelis, the fight for survival was about to enter a new and bloodier phase.